On Government Order of the Day, number 7.
Social Assistance Living Alone Payments Amendment Bill, Committee stage.
I declare the House in committee for consideration of the Social Assistance Living Alone Payments Amendment Bill.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Chairman.
The House and Committee on the Social Assistance Living Alone Payments Amendment Bill, and the question is that Part 1 stand part.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair.
Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you. I seem to be the only one who is expressing such enthusiasm to speak on the Social Assistance Living Alone Payments Amendment Bill. And I rise, Mr. Speaker, to share Labour's support for this bill. I think it's a common sense change that we will be debating in committee stages today, just to refresh the memory of the House around the purpose of this bill. It will amend the New Zealand Superannuation and Retirement Income Act 2001 and the War Pensions Act 1954, and it does so in order to simplify the arrangements for those who would be eligible for a living alone payment. Currently, a single superannuitant and veterans pensioner who is living alone are eligible for a supplementary benefit, and I think that makes common sense. Obviously, the costs of being a single superannuitant, you don't get the economies of scale when you're in a partnership. But those supplementary benefits are applied for separately, and this bill, instead of having that additional supplementary payment, introduces a new single living alone rate for superannuitants and for veteran pensioners. And it is also intended to remove the need to make a separate application for receiving the full entitlement. I think it's also important to point out, Mr. Chair, that those who are often entitled for these single payments become entitled after the passing of a partner or a spouse or a loved one. And trying to simplify this process for them at that point, I think is not only important but is also common sense. There are some issues, therefore, around the transitional arrangements that I'm sure members of this House might be interested in canvassing as we debate the individual clauses of this bill. I want to start, though, by looking in a little more detail at the impact of some of the definitions within the bill, within Part 1. At Clause 4A, the bill sets out the meaning of living alone, and given that all of the major parts of this bill hang off that definition, I think it's important to explore it. And it sets out that a single person is living alone only if he or she meets two conditions, and they are what you would expect. The first is around dwellings and occupancy, and it sets out there in subclause 2. The first condition is that person A occupies a principal place of residence of a kind described in subsection 6, which is quite detailed. It even goes on to talk about a boat or craft mooring being a suitable residence for that definition. And then it sets out probably where there might be a few more issues of debate, and that is that the second condition is that person A does not share that residence with any person 18 years or older, except a person to whom subsection 4 or 5 applies. The bill then sets out that this subsection applies to a person A's dependent child who is 18 years old, not financially independent, and attending a school or a tertiary educational establishment, but only until the close of 31 December in the year in which the child turned 18 years of age. So if we strip that back, what the bill is saying is that you're entitled for the living alone payment as long as your child is either in secondary school or is at a tertiary education institution but 18 years and under the age of 18 years. So basically you're never going to be able to claim the living alone payment if your child is over the age of 18 and outside of secondary school, essentially. Now, that may seem common sense on the face of it, but we took some issue at Select Committee with the fact that this could be deemed to be a very narrow set of conditions for what sometimes can be extraordinary circumstances. And the first of those extraordinary circumstances that I wish to raise is, in fact, if an individual is ever caring for a dependent who is over the age of 18 who may have an intellectual disability, for instance, and that they have some kind of carer role for that individual. Now, they would fall, technically, once they hit 18, they could fall outside of this criteria. Now, one could argue that under the Social Security Act, they may be entitled to some other form of benefit, but I think, Mr. Chair, it makes sense that instead we make sure that we build in enough flexibility to take into account those circumstances without opening it wide enough that it can be used inappropriately, as in applied to circumstances where instead perhaps a DPB caring for the sick or infirm might be more appropriate. But I think there is a way to deal with both issues, and I've have tabled for the House a supplementary, an amendment to the bill, which would allow for those circumstances to be taken into account, and it does so by adding to Part 2, Clause 18, the statement that unless that child has an intellectual disability as defined in Section 7 of the Intellectual Disability Compulsory Care and Rehabilitation Act 2003, just for the benefit of the House, it seemed to us to be the most appropriate definition for an individual with intellectual disability that we could find in modern legislation. So that's the first amendment that we would, as a party, like to move, is just to allow that additional flexibility for someone on a living alone payment who has some care responsibilities. But the second set of circumstances where we think this definition is too narrow is around the use of age rather than whether or not someone is actually financially dependent. Now we could explain what we mean by that. At the moment, we're only really concerned if the child it doesn't really matter whether they're at tertiary education or if they're at high school. We only really mind whether or not they're under the age of 18. Now, why is that? Surely the definition actually should be set around whether or not that individual in the home is financially dependent or not, because surely that should be what we consider when we're talking about social assistance in this way. Well, a student who's at a tertiary institution, for the purposes of student allowances, for instance, is considered dependent until they have reached the age of 25, because their student allowance is means tested against their parents. So if you're means testing against a parent, you're assuming some form of dependent relationship still exists. But for the purpose of this bill, we're not adding consistency. In fact, we're making it less consistent by saying it's not the age of 25 we're interested in if you're in tertiary education, it's 18. So it's our view that if someone is in tertiary education, because for the purposes of student allowance they continue to be means tested, then that child should be considered still a dependent for the purposes of this bill as well. Now, I'm sure that my colleague, the spokesperson for tertiary education for the Labour Party, Megan Woods, would probably like to expand on that in greater detail than I have, but that's one of our other suggested amendments for the House today. We're also concerned, Mr. Speaker, that if you are a student who is studying, of course there might be periods when you come back into the home for holidays where you are still a dependent child, and I would never assume financially independent, but that could interrupt someone's ability to access the social assistance living alone payment just by virtue of a child coming home for the holidays. So we've suggested another SOP that sets out that a person living alone is living alone if a child over 18 returns to live with a person's A's residence and stays there less than 13 weeks in any period of 26 and is not financially independent. So basically, if you're a student, you come home to stay with either mum or dad in your holidays, you're not financially independent, as in you're not on full-time work, then you should not have the effect of reducing down your parents' ability to access the social assistance living alone payment. And again, I think that's a fair amendment to make. So, Mr. Chair, I would appreciate the views of the government on those SOPs and those amendments. I think that they are reasonable ones. We did raise them at the Select Committee, and we did, to be fair, have a quite robust discussion about them. And I accept that when it comes to the student allowance side of things, that whilst it was an argument people accepted, it probably, if anything else, points to the inconsistencies around the application of the student allowance regulations more so than it does potentially for these payments. But as long as that exists, I think it needs to be remedied.
Asanati Lolly Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. New Zealand First has always supported legislations